When my grandfather died, nobody talked about money. There wasn't any. What they talked about was the tower. It was October of 1923, and I was 15 years old. The rains had just ended in our valley, a deep green cut between limestone ridges in the Yucatan lowlands, where the river ran brown and heavy through stands of ceiba and strangler fig. My grandfather had been the only person in my life who never looked at me like I was a problem to solve. He taught me to use a hand plane. He taught me to read grain in timber. He taught me that a building was only as honest as its foundation. Now he was gone, and the traders at the river post couldn't wait to tell me what he'd left behind. "There's an old watchtower on the ridge," one of them said. His name was Herrera, a thick man who ran mule trains between the coast and the mahogany camps. He wiped sweat from his neck and looked at me the way men look at dogs they don't intend to feed. "Your grandfather built it years ago. If you want it, it's yours, but it's falling apart." He said it like it was a burden, something nobody else wanted. The other men at the post said nothing, which was worse. A woman sorting dried peppers glanced at me and shook her head slowly, the way you shake your head at a child reaching for a wasp. "You'd be better off staying here," Herrera added. "I could use a boy to load crates. 2 centavos a day." I didn't answer him. I bought a coil of rope, a half kilo of nails, a small tin of lard for waterproofing, and a second-hand machete with a chip in the blade. It cost me everything I had, 11 centavos, saved over the course of a year carrying water jugs for the mission school. A week later, I climbed the ridge to see the tower myself. The path up was worse than I expected. The trail had been swallowed by growth. Vines thick as my wrist, ferns taller than a man, roots snaking across the limestone like something trying to hold the hill together. I cut my way through for 3 hours, sweating until my shirt was heavy as a rag. Twice I slipped on wet stone and caught myself on roots that tore the skin from my palms. The air was thick and still under the canopy, close to 90 degrees even in the shade, and the mosquitoes found me within minutes. But as I climbed higher, the canopy thinned. The air moved. I could feel it pushing against my face, a steady, warm current rising from the valley floor. Then I saw it. The tower stood alone above the tree line on the eastern ridge, a rough structure of stone and timber wedged into the side of a cliff face. It was perhaps 25 feet tall, built on a natural shelf of limestone that jutted out over the valley like a jaw. Wind pushed through broken planks. Half the railing was gone. The thatch roof had collapsed on one side, and a small tree had taken root in the gap, its pale roots threading through the stonework. From below, it looked like the first strong storm would tear it down. I almost turned around. I stood there on the trail with my rope over one shoulder and my chipped machete in my hand, and I thought about Herrera's offer. 2 centavos a day. A roof over my head, meals I didn't have to catch or dig for. Then I stepped inside. The foundation wasn't weak at all. My grandfather had anchored the base directly into the cliff rock, not just sitting on it, but sunk into it, with the lowest beams fitted into notches he had chiseled by hand into the limestone. I could see the tool marks, patient, even strokes. The outer boards were rotten, soft as wet bread where the rain had reached them. But the frame, thick hardwood beams, sapodilla and ramon, locked together with mortise and tenon joints and secured with wooden pegs, was still solid. I pressed my hand against the central post and pushed. It didn't move, not even a whisper. It wasn't collapsing. It was unfinished. I understood then what my grandfather had been doing. He hadn't built a watchtower for himself. He had built the bones of one and run out of time. The design was sound. The placement was deliberate. East-facing to catch the morning light, set back from the cliff edge to avoid the worst wind shear, positioned at the highest navigable point on the ridge. He had seen something from up here, something worth building for. So I stayed. The first week was the hardest. I slept on the stone floor of the platform with my rope coiled under my head and my machete within reach. The nights were loud, not quiet the way people imagine wilderness to be. Loud. Howler monkeys shook the canopy before dawn with a sound like rolling thunder. Insects screamed in frequencies that got inside your skull and stayed. Something large moved through the brush below the cliff each night around midnight. I never saw it. I only heard the snap of branches and the silence that followed, which was worse. I ate what I could find. Palm hearts cut from young cohewn palms roasted over a small fire I built in a stone ring on the platform. Wild papaya, not yet ripe, but soft enough to chew if you sliced it thin and let it sit in the sun for an hour. A freshwater crab I pulled from a seep spring 50 yards below the tower, its shell the color of wet clay. I lost weight that first week. My ribs showed through my shirt by the 5th day. My hands blistered, then bled, then blistered again over the raw spots, and I learned to wrap them in strips of cotton torn from my spare shirt before picking up the machete each morning. But I worked. I started with the rotten planks. I pulled them free one at a time, careful not to stress the joints underneath, and replaced them with fresh-cut boards I split from a fallen Ramon tree, using my machete and a series of wooden wedges. The work was slow. Each board had to be shaped by hand, fitted to the gap, and secured with pegs I carved from the hardest wood I could find. A dark, dense timber the locals called Chechen, which resisted rot better than anything else on the ridge. I reinforced the joints with wedges carved from fresh wood, tapping them into place with a stone until the fit was tight enough to hold without nails. I rebuilt the railing. 2 horizontal bars of sapodilla, each about 4 feet long, lashed to the vertical posts with strips of bark I soaked and twisted into cordage. I cleared the collapsed thatch and replaced it section by section, layering palm fronds at a steep pitch, close to 60 degrees, so the rain would sheet off rather than pool and rot. It took me 2 weeks to make the platform safe enough to stand on without worry. Then I started on the systems. I noticed that rain hit the tower mostly from the southwest, driven by the prevailing winds off the coast. So I built a rain catch, a series of angled boards along the southwest wall that funneled water into a channel I carved from a split length of bamboo. The channel ran down the outside of the tower and emptied into a clay-lined storage pit I dug at the base of the cliff. In a single heavy rain, I could collect enough water to last 4 or 5 days. I sealed the gaps in the walls with a mixture of limestone powder, charcoal, and lard, a paste my grandfather had taught me to make when I was 12. It hardened in the sun and kept out both rain and insects. But I didn't seal everything. I left narrow openings on opposite walls, each about 2 inches wide and 18 inches tall, positioned at different heights. The lower opening faced the valley. The higher one faced the ridge. The effect was immediate. Hot air rose through the upper opening and pulled cooler valley air in through the lower one. A steady draft moved through the tower day and night, not strong enough to disturb a candle flame, but enough to keep the air fresh and the temperature bearable even in the worst afternoon heat. My grandfather must have understood this. The placement of the original window gaps matched the same logic. He had designed the tower to breathe. I was 15 years old, and I was learning from a dead man. By the end of November, the tower was livable, not comfortable, livable. I had a sleeping platform raised 2 feet off the stone floor on a frame of bamboo, which kept me above the insects and the damp. I had a cooking ring on the open side of the platform where smoke could escape without filling the interior. I had a storage shelf for dried fish, smoked meat, and the small supply of maize I traded for at the river post. Labor in exchange for food, carrying timber for a carpenter named Davila, who asked no questions about where I lived. Davila was the first person who didn't look at me with pity. "You're living up on that ridge?" he said one afternoon, not as a question, but as a fact he was confirming. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. He was a quiet man, maybe 50, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same wood he worked. "Your grandfather talked about that tower, said it was the most important thing he'd ever build. Did he say why?" Davila looked at me for a long time. "He said from up there, you could see what was coming." I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. The first real storm came in early December. It wasn't supposed to be the wet season. The heavy rains usually held off until May or June. But the valley had its own rules. A front moved in from the coast, slow and dark, and by mid-afternoon, the sky looked like a bruise. The air went still. Even the insects stopped. I checked every joint, every lashing, every peg. I tightened the rain catch and weighted the thatch with stones. I pulled my supplies into the center of the platform and covered them with palm leaves. Then I sat on the edge of the tower and watched the storm come in. Rain slammed into the tower so hard it felt like the sky was throwing stones. The wind changed direction twice in the first hour, testing the structure from different angles. Lightning struck somewhere down in the valley, lighting the clouds from inside, a deep, flickering orange that turned the rain to copper. The bamboo rain channel rattled and overflowed. Water ran across the platform in sheets. But the tower held. The joints groaned once, near midnight, when a gust hit the southwest wall hard enough to make my teeth ache. I pressed my hand against the central post, the same way I had the first day, and felt it absorb the force without shifting. My grandfather's foundation, sunk into the living rock, did what it was built to do, and from that height, I could see something nobody on the ground could: the river. After 3 days of rain, it began to rise, not slowly, violently. I watched it from the platform through breaks in the cloud. The river had been running at maybe 15 feet across when the storm started. By the second day, it was 40. By the third morning, it had swallowed its banks entirely and was spreading across the valley floor like something with intention. I could see the water reaching into the lower camps, the seasonal shelters where chicle tappers and loggers stayed during the dry months. Some of those camps were occupied. I could see smoke from their fires, thin and desperate against the gray sky. They couldn't see what I could see. The flood wasn't just rising. It was accelerating. The watershed above the valley, miles of limestone hills covered in forest, was funneling every drop of rain into the same channel. The river wasn't just full, it was backed up. And when that pressure released, the water would move fast enough to carry trees. I had one lantern, a clay dish filled with lard and a cotton wick sheltered inside a frame of bamboo and oiled cloth. I hung it from the highest point of the tower, the peak of the rebuilt thatch roof, maybe 28 feet above the cliff shelf. Then I started shouting. Nobody heard me. The distance was too great, the rain too loud. But the light carried. In the darkness of a storm that had swallowed the sun for 3 days, that small orange glow on the ridge was the only fixed point in the valley. People saw it. The first group arrived before dawn on the fourth day, a family of 4, the father carrying a child on his back, the mother gripping the hand of a boy not much younger than me. They had seen the water rising around their shelter and climbed toward the only light they could find. "Is it safe up here?" the father asked. He was breathing hard. His legs were shaking. "The foundation is in the rock," I said. "We're above the flood line." He looked at me. A boy, alone, standing on a platform of hand-cut wood above a valley that was drowning. And for a moment, I could see him deciding whether to trust me. Then the wind gusted, and the tower didn't move, and he brought his family inside. More came through the night. I heard them before I saw them. The crack of branches on the trail below. The sound of breathing too hard and too fast. I hung the lantern higher and kept feeding the wick with lard so it wouldn't gutter in the wind. A woman arrived carrying a bundle of cloth that turned out to be medicine supplies from the mission clinic: iodine, cotton wrapping, a jar of quinine tablets. She had grabbed what she could before the water took the floor of the building. She didn't speak for the first hour. She just sat against the stone wall with the bundle in her lap and stared at the rain as if it had personally wronged her. By morning, there were 19 people on the ridge, chicle tappers with machetes and nothing else, a pair of traders who had been caught mid-river and lost their canoe and everything in it, a woman from the mission school with 3 children who weren't hers. She had pulled them from a flooding dormitory and carried the smallest one on her hip for 2 miles uphill in the dark. An old man named Sosa, who had lived in the valley longer than anyone, and who sat on the edge of the platform staring down at the flood with an expression I couldn't read. "Your grandfather," Sosa said quietly, not looking at me. He knew this would happen. How? He watched the river for 40 years. He said every generation forgets the last great flood. He said someone needed to be high enough to remember. The valley below was unrecognizable. Where there had been trails, there was brown water. Where there had been camps, there was nothing. The river had become a lake, and the lake was still rising. We stayed on the ridge for 6 days. I rationed the water from the storage pit, about a cup per person, twice a day, and sent the older children to collect more from the seep spring below the tower. The spring ran cold and clean, filtered through 50 feet of limestone, and I had tested it for months. I knew it was safe, but I boiled it anyway, because I had 26 lives depending on me, and I was 15 years old, and the margin for error was nothing. I showed the men how to build lean-to shelters against the cliff face using the same techniques I'd used on the tower: steep pitch, layered palm fronds overlapping like fish scales, drainage channels cut into the rock with the flat edge of a machete so water wouldn't pool under the sleeping areas. The chicle tappers were fast learners. They understood lashings and knots from their work in the canopy, and within a day, they had built 4 shelters that could sleep 3 people each. The woman from the clinic, her name was Mariana, organized the quinine tablets and treated 2 children for fever. She showed me how to identify the early signs of infection in the small cuts everyone had from the climb: redness spreading outward from the wound, heat in the skin, a smell like copper and wet leaves. I stored that knowledge the way I stored my grandfather's joinery techniques, carefully because it might save a life someday. We smoked fish that the flood pushed into the shallows below the ridge. Fat, confused river fish that had never been in water that still before. Sosa showed me how to build a smoking rack from green sticks, wood that wouldn't catch flame, only smolder. and we dried enough fish in 2 days to feed everyone for a week. I added wild chaya leaves to the meals, a green plant that grew thick along the ridge. Boiled for 20 minutes, the leaves were safe and filling. Raw, they were poisonous. The difference between food and poison in the jungle was almost always time and heat. Nobody went hungry. Nobody got sick. The tower held every night, and every night I hung the lantern, and twice more people climbed toward it through the dark. When the water finally dropped, 26 people walked down from the ridge. Herrera was at the river post when we arrived. He stared at me like he was seeing someone he didn't recognize. "The tower," he said. "It held," I said. He didn't offer me 2 centavos a day. He didn't say anything at all. Davila was there too. He handed me a new machete, good steel, no chip in the blade, and a small leather pouch. Inside were woodworking tools my grandfather had left with him years ago. A hand plane, a marking gauge, a set of chisels wrapped in oiled cloth, each one sharp enough to shave hair from your arm. "He wanted you to have these when you were ready," Davila said. "How did he know I'd be ready?" Davila looked up toward the ridge, where the tower was just visible against the sky, a small dark shape on the highest point in the valley. "He didn't," he said. "He just built it and hoped." I rebuilt the tower properly that dry season. Davila helped me for the first 2 weeks, showing me joinery techniques my grandfather had never had time to teach. Scarf joints for extending beams, fox-wedged tenons that tightened themselves under load, the proper way to season wood so it wouldn't check and split when the dry heat came. I widened the platform and added a second level, a covered observation deck with openings on all 4 sides, each fitted with shutters I could close against storms. I improved the rain catch system, adding a second collection channel and a larger storage cistern lined with limestone plaster. I built a proper hearth with a stone chimney that drew smoke upward and out, even in still air. A girl named Lucia came up the ridge one morning in February. She was 16, the daughter of a surveyor who had drowned in the flood. She had been staying at the mission school, but she didn't like being told what to think. She had her father's compass and a leather-bound notebook filled with his measurements of the valley, river depths, ridge elevations, soil types, rainfall totals going back 11 years. "I heard you can see the whole valley from up here," she said. "Most of it." She looked at the tower the way I had looked at it that first day. Not at what was broken, but at what was. "You can trace where every tributary feeds. You can trace where every tributary feeds the main channel." She was right. From the tower platform, on a clear morning, I could see the silver threads of water running down the limestone hills to the north and east, small streams that joined and joined again until they became the river that had nearly killed everyone in the valley. Her father's data made sense of what I could see. My grandfather's position made her father's work complete. Lucia came back the next day, and the day after that. We mapped the watershed together that dry season. She with her father's compass and notebook, me with the view from the highest point in the valley. We marked the flood lines on the ridges with cuts in the bark of ceiba trees so anyone could see how high the water had reached. We identified 3 other high points where shelters could be built, and I showed Lucia's measurements to Davila, who agreed to help build them. The work took months. Each observation point had to be cleared, leveled, and built to the same standard as the original tower. Foundation anchored in rock, frame joined without nails, roof pitched steep enough to shed water in seconds. Davila taught me to think about wind load, the force of a gust pushing against a flat surface, and how to reduce it by angling walls and leaving controlled gaps for air to pass through. The same principle I had used instinctively on the tower. He gave me the language to understand. Lucia kept records of everything: rainfall by week, river depth by day during the wet months, wind direction and strength, temperature readings taken at dawn and noon from the tower platform. She wrote in a clean, precise hand that was nothing like mine, and she organized the data into tables that made patterns visible. The slow rise of the river over weeks, the sudden spikes after coastal storms, the way the watershed collected water like a funnel and delivered it all to the same narrow channel. "Your grandfather saw this with his eyes," she said one evening, looking over the tables. "We're just writing down what he already knew." By the following wet season, the valley had a flood warning system. It wasn't complicated. 3 observation points, each with a lantern, a series of trail markers leading to high ground, a set of measurements, river depth gauges made from notched poles driven into the bank, that anyone could read. The next major flood came in 1927. This time, people saw it coming 2 days before the water reached the camps. They climbed to the high points without panic. The lanterns burned all night, and no one was lost. Herrera, who had rebuilt his mule operation along the river, lost 2 animals and a shed full of supplies. He stood at the river post afterward, looking at the mud that had, whether you listened or not, Lucia and a knot, 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 Lucia, and whether you listened or not. Lucia and I married in 1930. We were 22. We built our home on the ridge next to the tower, a proper house this time, with plastered walls, a tile roof Davila helped us lay, and a long covered porch that looked out over the valley. The tower remained as it was, maintained and improved each dry season. The lantern hung fresh each night during the rains. We had 3 children. The eldest, a boy we named after my grandfather, became a surveyor. The second, a girl, studied botany at the university in Merida and came back to catalog every medicinal plant on the ridge. The youngest carried Lucia's curiosity and my grandfather's patience and became a teacher at the mission school. The same school that had once told me I was too young to matter. I kept the tower for 53 years, every wet season. I climbed the platform and hung the lantern. Every dry season, I checked the joints, replaced what needed replacing, and carved new pegs from Chechen wood that would outlast me. I taught my children how to read the river, not just its surface, but its mood. The color of the water told you where the rain had fallen. Brown meant the limestone hills. Green-brown meant the forest floor. If the water went gray and fast, the upstream tributaries were full, and you had maybe 18 hours before the main channel swelled. Lucia taught them how to measure what they saw. She turned observation into numbers, and numbers into predictions that saved lives more than once. Together, we taught them that the valley was not something to survive, but something to understand. The years passed the way years do when you are rooted to a place, not quickly, not slowly, but with a rhythm that matched the seasons. The dry months smelled of dust and hot stone and the sweet resin of sapodilla bark. The wet months smelled of mud and green growth and the particular sharpness of rain hitting limestone. I learned to love both equally, the way you love both the inhale and the exhale of a single breath. People came to the ridge more often as the years went on. Not just during floods. Surveyors came to use the tower as a triangulation point. A botanist from Mexico City spent 3 weeks on the platform cataloging canopy species he could identify through a borrowed telescope. A government engineer visited in 1954 and recommended that the flood warning system be adopted in other valleys. It never was. The government had other priorities. But the fact that someone had noticed felt like a kind of validation my grandfather never received. The flood of 1961 was the worst in living memory. The river rose higher than the marks we had cut in the ceiba trees. Water reached the base of the ridge for the first time since my grandfather's day. But the tower held. And from the platform, my son, 33 years old by then, with children of his own, hung the lantern and watched the valley, and people climbed toward the light the way they always had. I died on the ridge in the spring of 1976. I was 68. Lucia was beside me. The children were there. The morning light came through the east-facing window of our house and landed on the floor in a bright rectangle that moved slowly across the room as the sun rose. I could hear the river below, running clean and low in the dry season, the way it always did before the rains came back. My grandson asked me something near the end. I don't remember the exact words. Something about the tower. Something about why my grandfather built it. I told him what I had learned. He didn't leave me land, I said. He left me the highest point in the valley, and the highest point is only worth something if you use it to see what's coming for the people below. The tower still stands on the eastern ridge. The thatch has been replaced with corrugated metal. The wooden shutters are gone, replaced by glass. Someone added a radio antenna in the 1980s. A concrete staircase replaced the old trail in 1994. But the foundation is the same. Hardwood beams sunk into limestone. Mortise and tenon joints secured with wooden pegs. My grandfather's patient chisel marks still visible in the rock if you know where to look. Every wet season, someone climbs the tower and hangs a lantern. It is not tradition. It is not ceremony. It is the simplest thing in the world. A light on the highest point, so the valley can see what is coming. My grandfather understood something that took me years to learn. You don't need to own the valley to matter. You don't need money or land or the respect of men like Herrera. You need one thing: a place high enough to see the truth, and the willingness to stay there when the storm comes. The jungle punished hurry, but it rewarded attention. The river still rises, the rains still come, and the tower still holds.